Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
There's about 80 plus autoimmune diseases where your own immune system attacks your body and it could destroy your organs and tissues. For instance, rheumatoid arthritis, your immune system attacks your joints, especially like in your knuckles, and it could deform your hands and cause swelling and severe pain. Systemic lupus erythematosus, where your immune system can destroy your internal organs like your heart and your kidneys. And then there's discoid lupus, which is mostly in the skin. You get that characteristic butterfly rash. But it turns out that certain autoimmune diseases, you can have flares it'll flare up badly in some people if you're exposed to a lot of humidity, a lot of heat, and in some cases ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So examples of these diseases that flare up in the sun would be psoriasis, scleroderma, which is a connective tissue disease, dermatomyositis, which we'll talk about in a minute, multiple sclerosis, but also rheumatoid arthritis. But that one, it's more because of the drugs they're using rather than the disease itself. The drugs make you photosensitive. So we'll go into all this. So for some people, the summer can be really rough on them with their autoimmune diseases. It can really trigger a flare-up. It can make symptoms terrible. So here's a Dr. Jeffrey Carlin. He's a medical doctor over at Benaroya Research Institute. He's been treating lupus patients there for decades. Benaroya Research Institute is over in Seattle. It's part of Virginia Mason. Virginia Mason's a hospital system over there. So here's what he says, because it's very interesting. I want to quote him. I've had patients come back from vacations in Hawaii, and all of a sudden they have lupus. So they were on the verge of developing lupus, the autoimmune disease, and the sun brought it out. He also goes on to say, and others where it's taken months to get their disease back in check after a severe sunburn. So they went out on the beach, they got a sunburn, and their lupus flared up like crazy. So, scientists are still trying to understand and learn the interaction between ultraviolet radiation, humidity, getting overheated, the sun, and these flares. But it's very interesting. So now they know for sure that when you're in the sun, it could trigger lupus in people who are already on the verge of developing it. They're already on track for developing it. But also, if you already have lupus, the sun can cause flare-ups of the disease. There's also pretty strong evidence for dermatomyositis. We'll go into that. You see that in women frequently. Severe sunburn triggers flares of psoriasis and scleroderma. Well, of course, they affect the skin, so that makes sense. So welcome to my episode, Summer and Autoimmune Disease Flare-Ups. What can you do? Hi, my name is Jerry Hickey. I'm a nutritional pharmacist. I'm also the Chief Scientific Officer over here at Invite Health. I want to thank you for tuning into the Invite Health podcast today. You can find all of our episodes for free, by the way, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just go to invitehealth.com/podcast, our own website. Please subscribe and please leave us a review. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health. So let's get going with this. Here's an interesting report, also from the Benaroya Research Institute. Interesting place. It's a social worker. She's the co-founder of Looms for Lupus, because this lady's had lupus for decades. Her name is Juana Mata, and she learned that the sun really triggers lupus flare-ups. So here's what she said. I remember driving to work and the sun was hitting me. I got a big rash on my face. My cheeks were very red. It was even hard to breathe. I started lathering up with sunscreen on my drive to work, but my symptoms didn't go away. After just a few hours at my desk, my cheeks would feel hot and itchy, my scalp would itch, and I got very bad headaches. I finally realized I was so sensitive to light that the lights in my office were making my disease flare. So now getting back to Dr. Carlin at the Benaroya Institute, too much ultraviolet exposure can be toxic for anybody. Sure, it could cause wrinkling of the skin, discolorations of the skin, and eventually lead to different forms of skin cancers such as basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma and melanoma, which is really toxic. And that's when you get sunburns or even tanning. By the way, I don't think most people realize that tanning doesn't protect you from skin cancer. So, but he explains it very nicely, very succinctly. When you get a bad sunburn, he says, the sun kills cells on the surface of your skin. Then your body gets rid of these cells by basically telling them to die in a process called apoptosis. In apoptosis, cells essentially self-destruct. Well, that's true, Dr. Carlin. So he goes on to say, then there's an immune response where white blood cells come in. White blood cells are your immune cells. White blood cells come in and chew them up. So it's getting rid of the dead cells. This is when some people get red and peel. And then new healthy cells are supposed to grow in their place. But he goes on to say, but in people with lupus and every other autoimmune disease, they have an overactive immune system. So when people with lupus get exposed to the sun and their cells spill their guts, according to him, it may trigger an immune reaction that's too strong. He goes on to say white blood cells get turned on, other immune cells get turned on, and pretty soon you have a total flare-up of your immune system. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. He goes on to say, we see many people with lupus, skin rashes, and even kidney problems as their immune cells go into overdrive and attack healthy tissue. So obviously, people with lupus have to be careful in the sun. So we'll get to my recommendations in a minute. Now here's a different report from the National Institutes of Health. Sun exposure may trigger certain autoimmune diseases in women. So we know there is something to this. So the sun inflames the skin. The inflammation in the skin overactivates the immune system. The immune system is already wrong-headed and attacking your body, so it makes the attack worse. According to the National Institutes of Health, ultraviolet radiation from sunlight may be associated with the development of certain autoimmune diseases, particularly in women. This is according to researchers at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. That's part of the NIH, part of the National Institute of Health. So according to them, this study found that women who lived in areas with higher levels of ultraviolet exposure, so that's a lot of sunlight, when they developed an autoimmune muscle disease called myositis, they were more likely to develop the form known as dermatomyositis. See, they could go into two different forms. Polymyositis, where you don't have a rash and you don't destroy your muscles, or dermatomyositis, which weakens your muscles and causes the rashes. The study from the National Institutes of Health confirms the association between ultraviolet radiation and the incidence of dermatomyositis. So there's a couple of studies showing this now. So what do you do? Well, temperature changes, sunlight, ultraviolet radiation can make an autoimmune disease come out in certain instances, but certainly causes flare-ups. It exacerbates the condition. So let's talk about multiple sclerosis. In multiple sclerosis, which is sometimes connected with low levels of vitamin D, which you make in sunlight, so that's a bit of a paradox, the sun can really trigger an onset of symptoms. Now, in multiple sclerosis, the patients with that, their immune system is attacking spinal tissue and brain tissue and nerve tissue. When they get exposed to too much sun, too much heat, hot, humid weather, they could develop something called Utah phenomenon. So Utah phenomenon, and that's like most people with MS, when they get exposed to like a hot, humid day, it's 85 degrees out and very humid, and they go out there and they exercise or something, they experience Utah syndrome, Utah phenomenon. So because it's affecting their brain and their spine and their nerves, a lot of fatigue, they could feel very weak, they could feel dizzy and have balance issues, their vision can blur, it affects their memory and their concentration. So I tell them, you have to be careful when you go out, because we have clients coming in with MS, and I tell them in the summer, I mention this on my radio programs, so then people contact me and say, hey, I have an autoimmune disease, what should I do? So people with MS, I tell them, listen, you don't want to take hot showers, you want cold showers. You don't want to sunbathe. You don't want to go out and exercise on a really hot, humid day. You don't want to use a sauna or a hot tub. All of those things, forget about that. Stay in the air conditioning. If you want to exercise, the best thing you could do is a cool swimming pool. That would be the best thing if you can get access to it. You know, like the Y or something, the YMCA or the YWCA. So stay in an air-conditioned environment when it's extremely hot and humid. Drink cold drinks. Put a lot of ice in it. You should also wear lightweight clothing. You know, loose-fitting, lightweight clothing. I mean, that should help. That should help prevent flare-ups of MS, because MS it really can hurt people. It can really hurt people. Now, what about lupus? About half of people with lupus are photosensitive. When you're photosensitive, it means that a normal amount of sunlight burns your skin. It shouldn't happen. A normal amount of sunlight for you burns your skin. You're very sensitive to the sun's ultraviolet radiation. But this can even happen under light bulbs, from what I understand. So it causes flare-ups of lupus where the lupus attacks your joints. So you could get like swollen joints, like your fingers can swell. You could develop that rash on the skin. You get very fatigued. Sometimes these people tell me they get like ulcers in their mouth or in their nose. They could get swollen, like their legs and arms can swell. Now, also some of the treatments for lupus can make you photosensitive. So it's like a double whammy. For instance, I don't think most people realize, and I don't think sometimes medical doctors or nurses or pharmacists realize, but regular NSAID drugs like Advil and Aleve can make you photosensitive. You're more likely to have a sunburn. But especially Plaquenil, which is strange. Plaquenil was developed to protect people from malaria, and people get malaria in these hot, steamy areas, right? We used to call them jungles. It's hydroxychloroquine, the drug that they said would help people with COVID-19. That drug, hydroxychloroquine, especially makes you sun sensitive. So I tell people with lupus, really apply a very strong sunscreen, like 50 plus. SPF 50. Don't even mess around with an SPF 30. Get an SPF 50 and apply it very thickly, because when they do studies on sunscreens, they apply them very thickly. So to get an SPF 50 effect, you have to apply it thickly. Most people who apply an SPF 50, they're really only applying an SPF 25 because they only apply half the amount they use in these studies. But also make sure it's a broad spectrum sunscreen, because there's UVA and UVB rays. The UVA rays go right through clouds, right through your window. They go deep into the skin. I would get the UV blocking clothing. I have that. You know, I have the Irish skin. I mean, forget it. The sun destroys my skin. So I wear ultraviolet blocking clothing. It's equal to an SPF 50, except it doesn't wear off. It works all day long. And I wear a hat. I actually have hats that are SPF 50 because I like to go boating. I mean, you could get skin like mine, you get destroyed in boating. So I get, there's a whole bunch of these companies on the internet. So I get UV blocking clothing, and I get a UV blocking hat, and I still wear SPF 50 on my nose and my face. And by the way, wraparound sunglasses. If you have lupus, you want to protect your eyes too. So get those ultraviolet blocking sunglasses. Now, I mentioned to you that even indoor lighting can affect lupus. Like halogen bulbs are super powerful, fluorescent lighting. So I know that you could get on the internet light shields that filter out the ultraviolet rays. So think of that. I even tell people when they have really bad lupus, you know, get ultraviolet window covers. So once again, if you have lupus, you have to be careful on very hot, humid days. You have to be careful in that sun. And now psoriasis and dermatomyositis. Because all that sunlight and humidity sometimes improves psoriasis, but if you burn, it'll trigger a flare-up. So you have to be careful. So you could wind up with those plaques that are itchy and they're red and they swell and they make you stiff and they cause joint pain. So once again, a broad spectrum sunscreen. Make sure it's fragrance free because otherwise that's going to irritate your skin. You should put all over, including over the psoriasis plaques. You really have to prevent a sunburn. But the thing is, sweat can also trigger flares. So if you're going to exercise, you have to do it in air conditioning or you have to do it in a cool swimming pool. And it's really smart to stay in air conditioning. Now, all that air conditioning, by the way, can dry out your skin, so use a sunscreen. Now, so those are precautions you should take if you have autoimmune disease. If you have any autoimmune disease, when the sun hits your skin, if it damages the skin and leads to a sunburn, that's inflammation. And when you inflame your body, you're increasing the activity of your immune system. So if it's already wrong-headed, your immune system, and attacking your body, you're going to cause an increase in the symptoms, or you're going to cause a flare-up of the symptoms. So be careful with that. Now, there are some supplements that can help certain autoimmune diseases that are safe to use with the drugs you use for autoimmune disease. And I mentioned to you before, and I didn't mention it to you now, patients with rheumatoid arthritis also use drugs similar to the people with lupus. So if they use an NSAID like Advil or Aleve or Celebrex or diclofenac, which is a pretty nasty drug because that drug can affect your heart. So even though it's a very powerful drug, I'm not in favor of that drug. But also if they use hydroxychloroquine, which is Plaquenil, that can make them photosensitive. And if they're photosensitive and they get a sunburn, that's going to cause a flare-up of their rheumatoid arthritis. So here's a couple of supplements. For any autoimmune disease, Biocurcumin 5-Loxin. It's safe to add to your drugs. In fact, here's an interesting concept. Let's say somebody has a low level of an autoimmune disease. It's not very severe. It's at like a low-grade autoimmune disease. It's not very severe. So they put them on some of the milder drugs that would not be successful in treating a severe stage of the disease. But because it's a mild level of the disease, they can use these safer drugs like hydroxychloroquine or certain types of tetracycline, which is an antibiotic. Or another example would be methotrexate with folate, with folic acid. If you add the Biocurcumin 5-Loxin to those drugs, they'll work better, and maybe the patients don't have to graduate to a more dangerous, more powerful level of drugs, like Humira or something like that. Because the more you suppress the immune system, if your autoimmune disease becomes more dangerous and more active, then they have to go to more powerful drugs, which means they're suppressing your immune system even more. And when that happens, it's easier to develop certain cancers, and it's easier to develop a dangerous infection. So if you could keep the drugs at a milder type of drug by adding something like Biocurcumin 5-Loxin, that's a good strategy. Biocurcumin is the curry herb, turmeric, but it's the entire herb and it's very well absorbed. 5-Loxin is from the frankincense plant, Boswellia serrata, and they come at inflammation from two avenues, the COX-2 enzyme and the 5-lipoxygenase enzyme. And it really helps with inflammation. There's a lot of data on that. So frequently when somebody contacts me with an autoimmune disease, I recommend that particular supplement for any autoimmune disease. Maybe not Hashimoto's thyroiditis. That might be more resveratrol, because resveratrol is a very tiny molecule that's an anti-inflammatory. That's really good for the thyroid. And because it's such a small molecule, it easily gets into the thyroid and can help assuage inflammation of the thyroid. It can mitigate it to a degree. For rheumatoid arthritis, I use Cartilage HX in people. Cartilage HX is amazing for people with rheumatoid arthritis. It's undenatured type 2 collagen with undenatured cartilage. And it's GRAS. All of these things are GRAS certification, generally recognized as safe by the American Food and Drug Administration, the American FDA. And you take one little Cartilage HX a day for typical osteoarthritis, the typical arthritis you get in the knee, and it's amazing what it could do for those patients. But in people with rheumatoid arthritis, I mean, it can help them get into remission, and it's extremely safe, and you only need one little capsule a day, and it's absolutely safe to add to any rheumatoid arthritis medication. So I want to thank you for joining us for today's Invite Health podcast episode. You can find all of the episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts, or just visit invithealth.com/podcast. Please subscribe and review. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health. And I hope to see you next time on another episode of the Invite Health podcast. And thank you so much for listening. Have a good day.